Nearly 7 years after the release of Final Fantasy XV, the next mainline numbered game in the series is finally here. Here are my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. So, I think Final Fantasy XVI is a game of two halves really, and I think that is down to the decisions that the developers have made to try and advance the series and to try and bring a wider audience into the game. There are things that I really like about this game and things that I don't like so much, and I'm going to try and explain it in a way that helps you to make the best decision for you, because I think ultimately whether or not you like this game depends on what kind of gamer that you are and what you're after in a big game like this. Just to sort of give you an idea of where I'm coming from with this video, I really like RPGs in general. Anyway, I'm a really big fan of games like Skyrim, Mass Effect, Dragon Age, The Witcher, all kinds of games like that. I never really got to play the older Final Fantasy games. I kind of ignored them when I was younger, didn't really think they would be for me. And then by the time I sort of realised maybe they would be something I was into, I didn't really enjoy turn-based games by that point, and so I never really got into the series at all. That all changed with Final Fantasy XV though. I know there was a lot of controversy with that game, but I liked it a lot, and then that continued with Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I also enjoyed a lot. So based on this and what I saw of Final Fantasy XVI, I was really excited. I expected it to be my game of the year for sure, even with Tears of the Kingdom. At the point of making this video, I think I must be about halfway through the game just based on how long I've played for, and I am going to keep playing while I edit this, so if any of my opinions change then I am going to come back and change them while the video is still being made. I won't be showing any footage beyond around the 5-hour mark, so I'm going to try and save from spoiling the game as much as possible. So the big question then, is Final Fantasy XVI a new era for Final Fantasy, and is it worth playing? Well, like I said, I think that depends on the kind of gamer that you are. The first and I think most obvious thing to say about Final Fantasy XVI is that it is an incredibly good looking game. The main characters, the environments, the creatures, the combat effects, it all looks absolutely amazing. It's not really a surprise because the further we get into the newer generation of consoles and the more that PS4 and Xbox is left behind, then the better the games seem to be looking. But even with that knowledge, there's an argument to be made that this game is one of the best looking of them all. Sometimes I really will just be looking across a valley or off a cliff down onto what's below, and it just kind of feels like it could be real. The lighting, the colours, I really think you could look at this world for hours. And when I included combat in the category of how the game looks, that was for a reason too. There's so many particle effects, fire, lightning, all sorts of abilities being thrown around. There's just so much on the screen at one time. You can really tell why this game wasn't also made for PS4. There's so much happening on screen. I don't think a PS4 could keep up. And, you know, I'm glad it wasn't made for PS4 as well. I'm looking forward to more current gen exclusives and more games that look like this, please. Now, while the game does look great, unfortunately there are a couple of issues with performance, especially weirdly in that performance mode of the game, which is supposed to target 60 frames per second, but it only seems to really hit 60 in combat. It's really smooth in combat, but then outside of combat, it seems to drop to, you know, around 40 and doesn't really always stay there. So I really think that at the moment, the best way to play the game is in that graphical mode, because it kind of seems to be locked most of the time to 30. But on the bright side, I also haven't encountered any bugs at all. I haven't encountered one character falling through the floor, not one environment that doesn't load properly, not one AI that gets confused during combat and stops attacking. And it's really refreshing in this day and age for a AAA game to actually feel complete on release, which Final Fantasy XVI does. So I mentioned the combat, and the combat in Final Fantasy XVI is a brand new system. Previous FF games started off being turn-based, a lot of them are turn-based, all the way up really until I think around Final Fantasy 15, that's when they started to move away from that. 7 Remake obviously has sort of the mix between action combat and turn-based system, and for Final Fantasy 16 it's just a pure action combat style. They brought in Ryota Suzuki from Capcom to oversee this, and it leans heavily into the character action style of fighting that you can see in some of their games, things like Devil May Cry, Dragon's Dogma, maybe even a little bit of Monster Hunter. This is absolutely the slickest and fastest paced combat of any Square Enix game I can think of, and I can't really see them going back to making turn-based Final Fantasy games from here. So you have your standard attacks, you can mix these in with ranged magic, dodges, dashes, knock-ups, you've got icon abilities. If you've always wanted to play a Final Fantasy game but you couldn't because you couldn't get into that turn-based combat, this one absolutely shines, and you might find something to completely fall in love with here just in the gameplay. And that is heightened even more when it comes to the boss fights. Oh man, the boss fights. Now the boss fights in this game are some of the most epic of any game that I've played. They are these set pieces on the scale of something like God of War. There's huge monsters that you fight, there's some mechanics to figure out, really impressive looking spells or attacks, and the really great thing about this is that the boss fights are long enough to give you time to properly get stuck into the flow of combat, and it is beyond satisfying when you've been fighting a boss and you're figuring out their attack patterns, you're executing perfect dodges and diving back to the fray. By the way, whoever created the animation for a perfect dodge and a dive back in, it just looks incredible, so that person deserves a pay rise. It makes you feel really cool when you pull it off. But these boss fights, they jump back and forth between combat and cutscene in real time to add to the spectacle, sort of like in God of War actually. And all of this is set to some of the most awesome music in a game that I have played for a very long time. And I'm going to show you a clip here. It's of a very early boss fight, so don't worry about spoilers. Just listen to the music in this fight. So the boss fights are really good. Do I have any problems with them at all? Well, really the only thing that I think is an issue is that I enjoy them so much that when I'm not in a boss fight, the rest of the combat can feel almost bland at times. Once you've fought a fair number of these bosses, the standard enemies start to feel very easy, pretty repetitive. There's not a whole lot of enemy variety, and the standard mobs don't really provide many mechanics for you to work out, and you very rarely have to put a lot of effort into them. Overall though, combat is good. There are a few other issues that I have with it, but I will get to those in a later section as they are related to something else I'm going to talk about later. The main storyline of this game centers around Clive Rosfield, who starts off on a quest for vengeance after a tragedy occurs in the opening hours, although the plot opens up a fair bit after not too long. I do like the main storyline a lot. Like the boss fights, it has a lot of really epic moments and it takes you to incredible locations, and it does have some amazing reveals as well, things you aren't expecting to happen. I also like Clive as a character. I think he's played well, I think he has enough depth to be a good main character, although he is a bit dramatic sometimes. The world has numerous factions, the story's got political plots, full-scale wars, it's really got everything you'd want in a good fantasy story, and it does feel, sort of loosely inspired by Game of Thrones. The game is also fully voice acted at this point, which is always a plus for me, although some of the side characters can be a bit samey and a little bit boring. So far, I'm really into the story. I'm really enjoying Clive's journey for vengeance and how it's opened up around that, and all the places you visit, all the plot points, they're really good. However, it does kind of feel like those really good plot points have sort of been stretched over too long of a time, and what's in between there doesn't really feel that great. Like I said, the game does have some really great plot points, but these are all dotted around, and in between that you're basically doing, fetch quest type stuff and watching people talk, and you watch people talk a lot. there are a lot of cutscenes in this game, and a lot of them are just of conversations that people are having. And I really hate to say it, but sometimes I have found myself picking up my phone just when I'm initiating conversations, and I know that they're going to go on for a little while, and I just don't want to watch another talking cutscene. And this kind of mirrors what I was saying about the combat too, when I mentioned the epic boss fights versus the kind of dull standard monsters that you fight in between. The story feels very similar to this. And it matches up pretty perfectly with the timing of the combat as well. As the story advances and you start to build up towards something epic, that's usually when you get a few more boss fights coming your way, and both the story and the combat build up together until you get some kind of, amazing story or reveal or culmination of a plot point, and at the same time you have these amazing set piece fights with a giant boss or a really cool mechanically fun boss to fight. And at that point you're having such a great time with the game and you're thinking, oh man, this is an amazing game. But the problem is once you're done, you then spend quite a long time just sort of running around, doing boring things, or just talking to NPCs and having really long conversations that you almost feel like they don't really progress the story at all. You can go from fighting these amazing godlike creatures in the icons to then just sort of hunting for a missing NPC, but not because they're important to the plot, but just because somebody asked you to do it while you wait for something else to happen. And I know what you're thinking, these sound like side quests and maybe I should just skip them, but no, actually this is the main storyline. And so the back and forth between these incredible high moments of this game and then the lowest lows, it can be really jarring, and sometimes when you just finish a high moment and you know what's coming, you don't always want to pick that controller back up right away. When you pick up this game, the first maybe 45 minutes to an hour, they're a bit confusing. You kind of feel like you've been thrown in, you don't really understand what's going on. And then from that point, the next couple hours of the game, suddenly everything goes off all at once. You have some really great fights. The story has a really good introduction to it once you've gotten past the initial part. And it sort of feels like a roller coaster. And then after that, again, for the next sort of maybe 4 or 5 hours, that initial stage of the game, there's great plot point after plot point, a lot of great fights. There are some slow moments, but it's not too bad. And so really, for the first sort of 7 hours of the game, I kind of thought this is going to be my favourite game ever. But then unfortunately after that, that's when some of these pacing issues that I'm finding have come around. And it can feel a bit like a shame really, because I want more of those really cool, really high moments. They feel really amazing, and so when you're in between those, it kind of feels almost like filler content, and it's a bit weird, and it almost reminds me a little bit of the main story questline from Final Fantasy XIV, the MMORPG made by the same studio. Now, I've not played loads of Final Fantasy XIV, but I've played enough of it, I've probably played like 70, 80 hours. I played enough of it to start to see some similarities between the two storylines. In Final Fantasy XIV, you sort of have these really cool, epic moments, and then in between it's filled with a lot of filler quests and go here, do this type of quests, and then you're back to another epic moment, a really cool boss fight or a really cool story moment. And so the similarities do seem to be there, but I'm just not sure that that style of questing works very well in a single player RPG. Although it is also a little hard to argue that this game could be called an RPG. So what do I mean by that? Well, there are definitely some RPG mechanics present in Final Fantasy XVI, but it's also very apparent that some of the in-depth features that we enjoy in previous Final Fantasy games just aren't really present at all. I hinted at this slightly when I talked about the combat, but things like status effects just don't seem to be in the game at all. Similarly, elemental weaknesses or resistances are absent too, so when you switch which icon you're channeling, your magic attack and your abilities, they do change between fire, wind, thunder, that kind of thing, but it only seems to be an aesthetic change. The triangle button doesn't do anything different depending on which element you're using, and your abilities that are fire don't do fire damage, your abilities that are thunder don't do any type of electric damage or anything like that. They're just damage with a few different effects. And so this can mean that there isn't really a huge reason to sort of cycle through your abilities or change them up at all. There are a few interesting ones, there's one that can block projectiles, and that does mix things up a bit, but really, like I said, once you've settled on something that you like using, there's not really a huge reason to change it, especially compared to other RPGs. You're not sort of like seeing a fire creature and deciding, oh, I can't use fire abilities on that because it won't damage it. And in fact, in this game, there is a fire boss that you can just hammer away at with your fire abilities, and that feels kind of weird, that the fire abilities still hurt it. In previous Final Fantasy games, there would be some kind of immunity or something like that, and that not being there just sort of feels like those mechanics are watered down a bit more. Party mechanics don't really exist in this game either. You do have some characters who tag along with you at various different points, but they don't do too much in combat. They sort of do some damage, but not too much. They don't do any status effects or elemental damage like I've already touched on. It's nothing like previous Final Fantasy games where you can customize your companions, change their weapons, change out abilities, things like that. It's all about Clive, the main character instead. He is the only character that you have management of, but you can't even really customize him. Once you've got some icons, you can pick through between a handful of abilities from them, but once you've found some that you like, I haven't really changed them up too often. You never really lose a boss fight because you didn't find the right weakness, and so you never really have to go back and review your build upon the second attempt. You're able to change your armor up a little bit, you have a belt slot, a bracer slot, that kind of thing, but it doesn't change how your character looks, and so far most of the items that you can equip just give you very basic stat buffs. And the same is true with weapons. You can change your weapons, and the weapons do change how your character looks. You can see the differences between the swords, but they just sort of give you 5 extra damage or something like that. Some of the boss fights drop some materials that allow you to craft a rare weapon, but again, these don't really do anything different. They just have more stats than the other ones. They don't have any unique effects or anything like that. And really, I've only found sort of one item that you can use to change up your playstyle a little bit, and it doesn't really properly change up your playstyle, but what it does is your perfect dodges, it enhances what you do after that. It sort of makes your attack stronger, so you just focus a little bit more on trying to time those perfect dodges just right instead of being fine with just a normal dodge. So that switches things up a little bit, but it's the only one that I found, and considering I'm probably halfway through the game and that's the only one I've found, it does start to feel a little bit empty. And the same is true of crafting. Everything you craft so far is just like +5 to a stat, apart from one quest where you seem to have unlocked a crafting recipe for a more epic piece of armor, but again, there only being one of those feels a bit like something's missing. So the last thing that makes this game feel a bit lacking in the RPG department is that there's no reason really to do anything other than the main story quest. I've sort of touched on it, but it's not like other RPG games where you can find all sorts of awesome blueprints for weapons and armor that you want to craft, and so you divert what you're doing to go on a big material hunt to find those things and really progress your character that way. There aren't any mini games, you don't find any hidden dungeons around the world with awesome loot or these incredibly cool optional bosses that you want to hone your skill on and you have to come back and fight a few times because they're harder than most things. You can't go on an interesting series of side quests and come out the other side with, a new ability or something like that. And in fact, the side quests have been pretty dull so far, just fetch quests with no interesting rewards, or in fact, any good rewards. I think the only one is that one that I mentioned about where I have now got the crafting recipe for a single piece of interesting gear. Now, there are a couple of interesting side quests, but really only a couple that have some fun lore around them, or they give you a better insight into the world. The rest of them I've just found a little bit boring, and I don't really feel like I've got a lot out of those. And the same is kind of true of the items that you can pick up off the ground. There's a lot of glowing points dotted around the map that you can go and pick up, and I divert to every single one of them out of habit really from playing all these other RPGs, but most of the time they're just 2 gil. So I mean, sometimes it really is just 2 gil, like you've diverted to pick up 2 in-game currency, or it's another 5 sharp claws when you already have 100 sharp claws for the crafting system in your inventory that you've not really used anyway. There's only really one time that I can remember where I found an actual weapon or piece of armor on the ground, and just that's it. In Final Fantasy 15, I remember quite often thinking, okay, I've just done a fair bit of the main story quest now, so I want to do something else for a bit, and then I would just explore the world or go and find an optional dungeon, or I even remember doing a series of quests where you just photographed places all over the world, and the main reward for that was just a lot of money, but then I used that to go and buy things to, progress my character by getting new weapons or things like that. In Final Fantasy 16, you don't really have anything to do with the money. I've amassed a load of money by now, but I haven't really spent it on anything. And like I said, there just aren't really any side distractions in Final Fantasy 16 at all. There's no way to progress your character or find something that will make you feel stronger, and so that progression is missing. And those reasons really are why I don't think it feels like an RPG so much. I think it feels more like an action game. Now, I realise that I've spent probably about half the video talking about negative things that I'm not really that keen on, I guess complaints if you want. And I don't really like to do that. I'm sorry that that's what I've done. It's just that the game wasn't really what I was expecting, and I think maybe it might be not what a lot of other people are expecting from a Final Fantasy RPG as well. It's kind of weird that this is the direction that it's gone in my opinion. However, that doesn't mean I think it's a bad game. Like I said, I'm really enjoying the story. I really like the combat. Those boss fights are incredible. The world looks absolutely amazing. And so I do think it's a good game. It's just not really what I expected based on the history of the franchise. And as a big fan of RPGs, I do miss those RPG mechanics from previous Final Fantasy games. And that's kind of the answer, I think, to whether you will enjoy Final Fantasy 16 or not. It really depends on what you want from a game. Are you a big RPG fan who really likes those deep mechanics, interesting side activities, and reasons to fully explore the world and have a look around all the zones and see what you can find? And if so, this game might not be what you want. On the other hand, do you find that kind of stuff really boring? You want a really fun and flashy combat system with amazing set-piece battles and a story that can be a bit slow sometimes, but really delivers in the high moments, a game set in a world that looks absolutely amazing, and where you don't feel guilty for skipping all the side content because you just want to plow ahead with the main story? If so, I think you'll have a really good time with Final Fantasy 16. And I've got a feeling that even though it's not quite the game that I expected, I think it's going to bring a lot of new people in who are really enjoying the spectacle of the game, they love the combat, and they finally feel like they can get into a Final Fantasy world without being bored by long RPG mechanics and turn-based gameplay. Like I said, for me, I am enjoying the game. I really like those epic moments, and I definitely want to see how the story ends. I just can't help but miss the things that have been stripped back from the series and those RPG mechanics that I usually like in games. I don't miss turn-based combat, so I guess for me, a really good Final Fantasy game would be a mix of the kind of combat that we have now, the story we have now, the world, but just bring back some of those in-depth RPG mechanics, and I think that would, for me, make the game a lot better, but I can appreciate that that's not necessarily true for everyone. So I just want to say, if you've got this far, thank you for watching me ramble on about Final Fantasy for a long time. I did have a lot to say about this one. I was really looking forward to the game, and it's not quite what I expected, but that doesn't mean it's a bad game at all. I do think it's a good game. I'd be really interested to hear what your opinion is on Final Fantasy 16. Are you really enjoying it? Are you loving the game? You think it's much better than previous entries and the series should continue like this? Or do you perhaps feel like maybe it's a bit of an oversimplification and some course correction is needed and they need to bring back some of those older mechanics? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode.